want you to take a look at something. Let's watch a little video here.
One value that runs through all of the work that JDAI does is to value every single child. Every single child. And that includes LGBT youth who are in the custody of the juvenile justice system. About 20% of young people in detention nationally identify either as lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, or gender nonconforming. The practice guide has 4 main sections. Foundational concepts and terminology about sexual orientation, gender identity, and gender expression. What we know about LGBT youth in the justice system. Recommendations for broad structural reform that really aims at a cultural change in juvenile justice agencies, and recommendations that are aimed specifically at the detention setting. Aside from the really specific recommendations that are made in the practice guide, the single most important thing that juvenile justice leadership can do is create an atmosphere in which everyone understands that all people treat one another respectfully, where it is completely unacceptable to use demeaning language, slang terms, terms that in some way display bias or discrimination against LGBT people. Creating that atmosphere is the single most important thing that justice leadership can do.
Yes. So let's talk about that video a little bit. So JDAI, the Juvenile Detention Alternatives Initiative, they have some great information. So write that down, because that's a great website to go to. As you saw in the video, they have a practice guide there that gives some great information. And it's information that's specific to the environments and to the youth that we serve.
Are there example SOGIs?
This,
Examples of
yes.
the SOGIs they use?
Yes. Okay. So they have the SOGIs on there. They have, I'm going to pass you out some information that came off of their help page. But when you're looking at the information, yes.
Is that out now so I have something to write on?
Yeah, I guess I could do that. Yeah. Yeah. Let you know that way. I could have given you something earlier. No problem. So when we think about that video, let's talk about it a little bit. Think about what she said about, you know, the single most important thing we can do. How do we create these environments where basically no one's being violated, right? Because as I mentioned earlier, the worst thing that we could do is send these kids out of our systems, out of our programs, worse than they were when they got to us. That, in my opinion, that's the worst thing that we could do, is cause additional harm. What's happening in your organizations that you can share that you feel maybe has been transforming, or maybe even on the verge of it, or an idea that you guys are tossing around that would be helpful to others in creating an environment where kids are not being harmed, where transgendered youth are being empowered and are in environments that are meaningful and useful to them? Yes?
So at our house, we did a 10-week-long program on a weekly basis where our vocational manager at Youth Progress came and did a group on sexuality and gender. Mm-hmm. And for 30 minutes, once a week, the clients sat around and slowly learned more about this very complex understanding of what sexuality and gender eventually led to gender identity, and watching these guys like just kind of like laugh at first and be like, what does that even mean? Like, how do people like even identify this way? And seeing them go from not understanding it and being really fearful and rejecting of the ideas to slowly learning what these concepts meant and what the possibility of gender identity and sexualities could be. We saw them start to become much more comfortable having conversations about it and asking questions without laughing.
Yeah.
And being able to really just be open and engaged in a conversation where at the beginning of that 10 weeks they would have just laughed it off and said, that's not me. Whereas a lot of the guys were like, maybe I feel a little bit that way. I don't know, but being comfortable enough to say that in a space that, again, at the beginning of that lesson, nobody was comfortable. So I think that, as most things that we're afraid of, it's because there's a lack of understanding. So
Yeah.
providing the knowledge and the space for that was really influential for our house.
And you know what was good about that is that you took the appropriate amount of time. If it takes 10 weeks, it takes 10 weeks. If it takes 12 weeks, it takes 12 weeks. But you give it what it needs, right? So you don't rush it and you don't push it, but you make sure that as you're delivering the content that you spend the appropriate amount of time discussing whatever it is that you need to discuss before you move on to the next. Because if you don't, it's sort of like thinking you can learn algebra before you learn to add. You have to have a foundation that's stable and that's strong that you can build on. Someone else. What else is happening out there?
Well, the ultimate,
Yeah.
Janice just opened a program.
Yeah.
That is specifically for youth in the community.
Yeah, yeah. And I think that's something that we have to make sure that we're continuing to talk about. We want to make sure that we're utilizing the resources. The worst thing we can do is build resources and they don't come. They say build it and they'll come. Well, you can build it and they may not show up if they don't know that it's built. And so we want to make sure that that information gets out into the community so that we can help. If we're putting finances and partnerships together that are meaningful, then we need to make sure that we're doing also the due diligence of making sure that that information makes it out so that the kids can utilize it. And there are a lot of great examples of things that are happening in conversations that are taking place. But as you saw and heard on there about, 20% of youth, in the system identifying, we also recognize the hurtful statistic that 100% of youth that identify on the spectrum of LGBTQ within our system have engaged in some form of self-harm or have had thoughts of suicide. And that's really sad. That's really sad. Because at the end of the day, we do want these young folks to grow up. We want them to become productive, meaningful, contributing individuals that can live the lives that they want to live and be able to experience the happiness that all of us deserve to experience. And just because they've made a mistake or they're in a system doesn't mean that they aren't deserving of that happiness. And landing within OYA should not be the end of the world for these kids. It really shouldn't be. And landing in your programs and in your residential environment should not be the worst thing that's ever happened to these kids. It really should be one of the places that when they get older, they stop and look back and say, oh my goodness, I'm glad that that existed. And maybe what can I do that can help further the cause? And what can I contribute? Because what we find, especially with a lot of these kids, with all of these kids, but as I look at some of these kids, they come with such unique gifts that if we were to access and utilize the gifts that they had, boy, they could make some really positive contributions to their environments. And whether it's their artistic gifts or their whatever it is that they do, whether they are mechanical, whether they're academic, whatever it is, all of us enter this earth with some skill set. And if we can help to identify, nurture, grow, and enhance those gifts of the kids, then they're going to be better off. So what'd you think about just that video? Even the sites that you saw in there. What did it cause any emotion? Did you get anything out of it? I mean, she says something, she doesn't say a whole lot, and it's a very short video, but it is powerful if you think about it. She makes some very powerful statements, and their organization is a powerful organization. What you think? I'm just soliciting just whatever your raw feelings were on. Because they show males, females, they show people together, they show different colors, cultures.
Well, one of the things that stood out for me, having had worked in close custody, that we have progressed in our own agency, and that we don't have youth lined up with their hands behind their back, single file.
Yeah.
You know, I think that is a huge change.
Yeah, dressed up in jumpsuits, right?
Having the ability to have clients actually be sitting back to back and touching without the fear of violating one another. That was another good example of being more in line with humanity, and that we are people who do strive for human touch.
Yeah.
It doesn't always mean it's going to be a violation of somebody's personal space.
Yeah, yeah, because we all desire human touch, right? We all entered the earth as someone's newborn baby, that at the very beginning someone swaddled you and wrapped you close, and everyone wanted to hold you close and lay you on your mom or dad or whoever it was that was going to nurture you and all of that. And then all of a sudden you enter a system and you just strip that away. I mean, we recognize that that's more harmful.
More alone.
Yes.
Let alone the difference that you possess that is either not acknowledged or respected.
Yeah, and if you're a transgendered youth and you've already felt like no one really attaches to you because no one gets you, and now no one wants to touch you, and that every time you touch something it's considered to be bad, that'll put a young person on a downward spiral. So that's good. Good observation. Thank you. So I want to take a little bit of a look at how Oregon measures up as a state. And Oregon is known as a very trans-friendly state. We do lots of things in Oregon that enhance the communities and grow acceptance. There's a lot of social engagements and opportunities. Oregon is on the forefront for employment opportunities and acceptance for respect for the transgender community. As we see here, Oregon's been at the forefront of initiating legislation and programs which have given its LGBTQ residents the same rights and protections as everyone else. Improved accessibility to health care. There's also tons of advocacy groups. There are a lot of resources around the state, but they're also, we're looking at reducing discrimination and improve the quality of life of transgender people, because transgender people have some of the lowest quality of life out there than almost any other population. And even as we're talking, I'll go back a bit to the video. The only population that has worse outcomes in juvenile justice or in justice systems that are worse than those of black men are those that identify as on the spectrum of LGBTQ. And that's sad, because as black men, we have very bad outcomes in justice systems. And so to think that we have kids that have worse outcomes is sad and disheartening, and it's not a good direction for us to go in. But Oregon as a state, we do well. Again, the Oregon Health Plan provides coverage for transition-related care, including reassignment surgery and hormone therapy and puberty suppression. Oregon was the first state in the nation to cover its trans youth under Medicaid. Those are good things. Those are really good things, and it's information that youth in your program should know, and youth that are in OYA should know, because when they get out of OYA, while they're in OYA, I should say, OYA assumes the cost for their health care. But when they get out, they need to know where to go to get health care. We have youth that are on hormones. How do they continue those when they get out of the system? Who do they go to in order to make sure that their bodies are healthy. Because just because they don't connect with the fact that whatever sexual organs they have doesn't mean they don't need to be healthy. And so it's important that our transgendered population get the appropriate health care and that they're mentally, emotionally, and physically healthy. We're taking a look on the national front. So 2016, the National News Association for Transgender Equality completed the second iteration of the National Transgender Discrimination Survey. They had the largest amount of respondents than they had, and even that they expected to have. And they had almost 28,000 people respond. And so this was a national survey that was devoted to looking at the lives and experience of trans people. And if you want to get information on that, you can go and find that on the website for the National Center for Transgender Equality. There's a lot of good information there. There's everything from the quick executive summary down. They'll give you the complete document on the outcomes of that survey. We'll show a little bit of what happened with that survey. As noted and as expected, the first statement, discrimination was pervasive throughout the entire sample. And we know that, right? That shouldn't surprise anyone that discrimination was pervasive. So looking here, the combination of anti-transgender bias and persistent structural racism was especially devastating. People of color, in general, fare far worse than white participants across the board, with African American transgender respondents faring far worse than all others in most areas examined. The respondents lived in extreme poverty. It's hard for transgender folks to get jobs, hard. Because they walk in, folks don't think they look the way they're supposed to look. Like, what's that all about? What's missing here? There's always that look. And for those of us that are in any, so most of us here are female, the majority of folks in the room are female. You know when you walk into a room when someone gives you that look, right? Like, oh, her. The same way that transgender folks get that same look, the same way that African American people know that look and that feel. My wife sometimes says that women have this feel for people. They can tell if there's an ick factor. She's like, oh, that guy gives me the ick factor, Bryant. I'm like, don't say that. But we all have areas in our life that we're sensitive to. And so transgender people, when looking for work, report that it's hard. It's hard to go in and get a job and have that workplace respect who you are. Why should you have to go in there and be something that you're not when you're going in there and you're qualified to do the work that they're saying they want someone to do? Just because I don't walk the way you walk or talk the way you talk or dress the way you dress doesn't mean that I'm not appropriate or that I cannot be effective at the work that you've announced that you have. As you see here, staggering 41% of the respondents reported attempting suicide. You know, and it says here compared to 1.6% of the general population, with the rates are rising due to bias. We looked at kids being bullied in school. These kids get bullied tremendously. Household incomes are lower. Physical assaults, 61%, and 64% for sexual assaults. I mean, these are like staggering when you think.
Safe to say that domestic violence is higher as well?
Yes. Mm-hmm. Yep. Studies have shown that, you know, and the domestic violence sometimes is a result of some of the other things, you know, like when you're struggling for money, and when you're, you know, struggling to find, you know, acceptance in the workplace, or, you know, things are happening at school. Yeah, it amplifies and makes that personal home environment, you know, more explosive. And so the outcomes of that is that, you know, domestic violence is higher. There are some folks that believe, oh yeah, you know, you get a bunch of gay guys and then they're always so full of drama and that's why it is. It's not why it is. It's that after you've spent the whole day being beat up by the world, you're on edge. And sometimes there's that feeling of set off. Does that make it right? No. It doesn't make it right to have that abuse there, but there are some answers to the questions. So let's talk a little bit. So how would you describe your own feelings and reactions to the LGBTQ community? Because we've talked a lot about it, and all of you have your own level of engagement and interactions with your own LGBTQ communities, either personally, professionally. We can talk professionally. Well, let's talk about that. What are the feelings? And it may not, let's just say not you, but maybe let's talk about your organizations. What are your organizations or your environments? How would you describe how they feel and react to the LGBTQ youth that you take in? And it is important to have a good leadership, because if you don't have your leadership on board, then, and your management, it's just hard to push it forward, right? It's hard to get, your feet underneath you and to do the things that you need to do and be what you need to be and create what you need to create in order to put things together that are sustainable and that are meaningful. And so it's important to remember that. And whether you're in large areas like Portland, where you have all these great resources, or you're in Bend, where you may not have as many resources available, what we have found is that this is a community of individuals that will do whatever it needs to do in order to support its own. And so I wouldn't be afraid to reach out if I were in outlying areas, to reach out into some of the inner city organizations, because they typically, in my experience, will rise to the call. I had a need down in Grants Pass, and I had an individual drive from Portland to Grants Pass to take care of it. And so we have found that when we ask, typically we get. And of course we're OYA, and sometimes we have the ability to offer some resources and such that can make that happen. But we also have found that in the area of, for transgendered youth, that there are a lot of folks that care, and the voices sometimes aren't real loud, but they are definitely powerful. And the work that they're willing to do is very meaningful work, and folks that will sit down and that will travel out. So if you're in outlying areas, please, and you're looking for resources, and you have the specifics about what you're looking for, and you need that, give me a call, and let's put our heads together and see what we can do. So talk to us, everyone. Let's talk about how would you describe your interactions with the LGBT, oh, I missed a Q in there, LGBTQ youth you encounter in your work. What does that look like? Because I think sometimes we all assume that everyone's doing this great job but us. It's like, oh no, we're going to keep our information down here, we're not doing good. But I'd like to create, just a really safe space for us to talk about what does that look like when you have a kid that identifies, maybe openly or not, that comes into your home, into your program. What does that look like? What does their onboarding look like? What's the interaction look like? Do they know who to go to? How do you engage them? How do you get them what they need? Well, I think it sounds like you're taking the right, you're establishing the right practice, because when it comes to equitable practices, it is about meeting people at their need. We've all seen, hopefully we've all seen that, if you haven't, it's easy to find the visual of, the difference between, with how to define equity, and they show the folks the kids looking over the fence. And like, if you give all the kids that are different height the same size box, then, some can still see over, some now can see way over, and some still may not be able to see. But when you meet a person at their need, you give the shortest one the tallest box so they can see over, and maybe one doesn't need a box at all. Maybe they can see over, and so you're doing what you need to do for that youth, and you have valid reasons. So it isn't that we like this kid better, it's that there's an increased risk, for violation and for harm and extra drama and some of the other things that you just don't need to have to deal with. And so, and most of the time, you find that other people respect that, and they don't have issue with it until you tell them no about something, of course. But but typically we find that is a great practice.
Yeah.
But you know what? It is where you're at, and there's value in identifying wherever you're at. And I wouldn't say it's embarrassing at all. It's embarrassing if you don't know at all. But you know where you're at, and you know what you're taking some first steps to get to wherever it is that you need to get to, and to recognize where you're at as the first step to getting to the right place. And the fact that even folks are able to come to those meetings and say, I got a kid who identifies as this or who doesn't feel this way, is a good first step. Because you could be in an environment where it's say nothing. Don't acknowledge, because acknowledgement could mean liability. Could mean that if we know something we're not doing something about, we're opening ourselves up. We'll just say that we don't know. But you're knowing, and you're working on what do you need to do in order to answer the questions, and even figuring out what are the questions. And maybe that's a good first step, is getting together and saying, when we hear this or we know this, what are the questions we should be asking ourselves? And what are the questions that we should be asking our youth? And how can we make this situation better the next time it arises? And you just build on that. It's, you know, so I don't think that's embarrassing at all. Not at all. So what type of environments do you hope to create? Hopefully it's like the equitable, inclusive environments that are empowering and accepting. And but we all have needs, right? Some of us have systems needs, process needs. Some of us have policy needs. So if you were to say that in your environment, what would we, if we were to be able to help you with one key area of development, what would that be? And as far as creating to go toward creating the environment that you want to create. Yeah. So if we were to, let's go a little deeper, we were to help those kids, we were to come up with a basics for training for them, what do you think they need in your environment? And you might adopt a theme, you know, this month it may be, you know, pronouns that you hang up, and the next month you may hang up definitions of terms related to gender. You could then move on to, you know, whatever type of expressions or finding other articles or information, and just kind of each month you could have a theme where you just hang it up and let it be known that these are just educational resources that, you know, no one's being, you know, they're not being shoved down anyone's throat, and nor is it an attempt to change anyone else from who or what they are, but it's an opportunity to grow and to learn about the world around them. I always mention that we have staff that struggle with some of the same issues in their own lives. And then they come to work, and we ask them to help solve the problems of these kids. We have staff that come to work that deal with their own gender issues and their own abuse issues and their own inadequacies. And so then they come to work and we say, but help this kid. And inside, they're in as much turmoil as that young person is. And so you can't give something you don't have. You know, and even as you were talking about the questions, you know, asking the questions and helping, we had a little forum where youth were able to talk to, LGBTQ youth were able to talk with some straight youth, and it came up that when you have questions, please don't ask me who I sleep with or how I'm pleasured sexually. We don't go around in society asking people about that. Why is that such a big issue to you when it comes to our population? And folks kind of like, it really like shut folks down. Like, how do you tell someone, no, I'm gonna ask you anyway? You don't. And so, you know, to be able to have things out there about what are appropriate questions to ask. How do you ask questions respectfully and responsibly? And what does timing look like? Like, don't get me in front of a big group and start asking me a bunch of questions about being transgender. If you really are curious and you want to have a meaningful conversation, do it the way you would any other conversation. Ask me if we can talk about something and find a time and a place where it's meaningful for both of us. You know, and so being able to set up, you know, the right environment and helping, because I think a lot of our kids struggle with those boundaries at times.
And when you do it, what's the intention?
Yes. What's the intent? Yeah, state your intent. Why? We had, at one of our support groups, we had a young man start showing up to what was our SOGI, or Be Your Own Self group. And the guys that typically come were kind of wondering, like, why is this guy showing up here? Is he trying to like make problems or something? And he just simply said, after week 2, the first week he didn't say anything, second week he said, my brother just came out to me, I need to figure out what this is all about. And it really broke the ice. These guys were like, well, let me tell you, isn't that your brother's not your brother anymore? And, you know, and they had good laughs and they talked about it, but he just stated his intent, like, because they were wondering, like, why are you sitting here asking some of the questions you're asking? Then when you stated the intent, it came out and it was fine. Cool. And the staff piece is really big. We find that in OYA that's a really big piece. And staff struggle with either getting the education, what to do with it, what does it make them accountable for once they know something. And some of them struggle just because of their own personal beliefs. But I always tell them, no one's trying to change anyone's personal beliefs. What you want to do is get enough information so that at the end of the day, if and or when the topic ever lands on your doorstep, you have enough information to be able to process it, because you might think you know how you feel about it today until it lands on your doorstep, until it's your cousin, until it's your son, until it's your daughter. Then I assure you, you'll process it completely different. You'll waver in your faith, you'll waver in your moral beliefs, in your standards, in your upbringing. All of those things will come crashing down and you'll need to rebuild. And if you don't have some level of education, you will crash when it crashes. And you don't want to crash. We don't want our staff crashing, and nor do we want individuals crashing personally. And I don't think that's an uncommon struggle. I think it's a very common, and it's a struggle that I think every staff person who works with these youth struggle with every single day. The boundary thing, whether it's the physical boundaries or the professional boundaries. I had a thing where I was going to support our group at McLaren, and one kid, he like talked to me all the time. Was a great kid, and just was really friendly, and got so that he was very comfortable around me and would share things with me. And you know, every time I saw him, he'd like, "Hey, Brian," he'd give me, you know, a little hug and all that. And then I had to stop him and was like, "Hey, you know, you can't full frontal hug me like that. And I'm not being mean or anything, but it's my responsibility to you and to me to make sure that we have a good, healthy, established relationship. And that's not appropriate." And so but you know, it happened, a talk just between he and I, and he gave me some pushback, like, "Oh, so, you know, this and this, you know, I'm not trying to do anything." I'm saying, "No, I'm not saying that you are, but even the appearance of is inappropriate. And it's not for you. I'm not saying that you've done anything wrong. It's for me as the professional and as the adult to make sure that you know. It isn't for you to know. And that's why I'm doing this, so that it helps you and it helps keep me in the right place also." And so that line, sometimes it gets blurred before you see it coming. And then you have to figure out what you do with it, even when that happens. And the mentor thing is big. We struggle with mentors. You know, our biggest need is at McLaren, and even the commute between Portland and Woodburn it becomes a struggle with mentors at times, and the consistency for what we want to see. Typically, it isn't hard to find someone who thinks they want to mentor, but the consistency of saying, "Well, yeah, we're kind of looking for someone that can do it once a week, you know, for an hour, hour and a half," and to have that consistency and coming down every week is hard because life happens. And then, you know, but then someone feels like, well, life happened 3 times, and now this kid is upset, and we're not sure if this is the right mentor, and, you know, so we have those challenges also. So let's talk about a little bit few did you knows. So, and we've talked about these along the way. So did you know as many as 30% of these youth experience family violence during the coming out process? I think I said 40, it says 30. Did you know that there's an increased likelihood of running away and experiencing homelessness? We talked about that, higher truancy, absenteeism, and dropout rates amongst these kids. There's a decline in academic performance and a greater likelihood in facing harsh disciplinary infractions. What's sad is that these kids do get disciplined harsher than other kids. Like, life isn't hard enough for them already. They go in, they get in trouble, and there's sometimes the appearance that some of these larger systems, academic systems, just want to get rid of them. Like, let's just find a way to get this kid expelled. I've never personally heard anyone say that, full disclosure, but it feels that way to a lot of the kids that we talk to. And there's a greater likelihood of engaging in high-risk sexual behavior, such as survival sex. There's this feeling and this kind of perception amongst some that anyone who identifies on the scale of LGBTQ has nothing on their mind but sexual activity, and that they are attracted to anything and anyone that's like them. And I always tell folks, don't fool yourself. Like, we don't want this guy coming in our living unit because he's gay. He may want to have a relationship with me. No, no one wants to have a relationship with you. I mean, you look at some folks, you're like, no, not with that personality. There's nothing that this person wants to have to do with you. And we have got to find a way to break those things, crazy notions in the community, like, oh, he's gay, we can't be in the same sex bathrooms or showers because they're gonna be looking at me. Everyone has their type of people. Everyone's attracted to someone emotionally, mentally, sexually, whatever it is. Just because you're gay doesn't mean, a gay man doesn't mean you're attracted to every single man you walk by. Just like every gay woman's not attracted to every single woman they walk by. It just doesn't happen. But there's this thing that there's all this high-risk sexual behavior because they're just oversexed and just can't have anything else on their mind but sex. That's not the case. And you think about it, with the age and the population of kids that we deal with, their bodies are changing, hormones are happening, you know, they're on these paths of discovery, and sexual activity as a part of that discovery and that path, and to, I guess in lack of a better term, cut off that part of the brain and say, you don't ever think about it, there's nothing, there should be no part of you that has anything to do with it, it isn't the healthiest thing. And so as a system and as an environment, I'm not sure what it takes or what, you know, reforming that area of juvenile justice looks like. But, you know, even I was at a health conference about transgendered youth, and they were having a discussion about puberty suppression, the puberty suppression drugs, and that they have found that families that have had their kids on puberty suppression drugs from the very beginning, pre-puberty, and then when those folks got older and wanted to do transition surgeries, especially those that were born biologically male, that they didn't have enough biological material in order to do the surgery because they didn't fully develop. And so there's some research and some studying that's happening out there on what needs to happen, because now the long-term goal of transitioning is being questioned and being stopped and being called into kind of this stall mode because the body didn't get a chance to fully develop or didn't develop far enough because of the puberty suppression drugs. And so, you know, we're learning more along the way. So we think, you know, at one point there's something that's very useful, meaningful, and appears to be healthy, and then on the other end, we're finding that there's some repercussions to that as a system and as society, basically not so much a system, but as society, we're having to relook at and revisit, and so that then will affect systems like ours. And then the increased vulnerability to sexual exploitation, sex trafficking, both male and female, for this minority youth. And there's just a vulnerability out there when, and it isn't that these kids are oversexed again, it's that, you know, that mental connection and the defining of what a relationship is and what love means, and that when that doesn't happen in a healthy way, that there's an opportunity for someone to take advantage of that vulnerability. And so then that leads to the exploitation of some of these young people. We talked a little bit about tools. One of the tools that a lot of organizations use in order to help kind of go through is the gender unicorn. Monica, remember when I called it the gender hippo? It's the gender unicorn. And it's a tool, it's online, and it's a resource in a way that some have found is a way, some folks don't like it. There are a lot of different tools out there. There's the gender the genderbread man, which a lot of folks like better because they're like, why'd you use a unicorn? Use something that's a little more closer to, who we are biologically. So there's some tools out there. So, when you go online, you can Google, transgenderstudent.org, and there's a lot of different resources. Take a look at those because those may be ways that you can help to educate your staff, especially on maybe what it is that these young people are going through. And then, maybe a person that's more qualified and that has a more meaningful relationship can go through and help some of the youth that may be having some questions. Some of the things that we can do. Before we go there, I want to talk just a little bit about a little bit of the standard that we at OYA have put into place for providing services. I just thought about that I missed in my head. And that is that we use a baseline of gender dysphoria, a diagnosis of gender dysphoria, for providing services and resources, medical services and resources to our youth when they're making requests for to go on hormones or to have gender affirming housing and some things like that. So we take our youth through I'm losing my words now, it's almost 3:30, through the evaluation process to see if they meet the threshold for gender dysphoria. And we utilize specialized psychiatrists and psychologists in order to help us come up to determine whether or not our youth have gender dysphoria. And that's just because as an organization, we need to show a threshold for providing those services. It isn't something that your organizations have to do, but it's one way to establish kind of a baseline for where you provide what type of services. You don't have to have gender dysphoria in order to be called a different name, but if we're going to have, going to support a youth in hormone therapy, then we want to see that this youth, that this is treatment and this is going to benefit this youth because the OYA is then spending taxpayer dollars in order to provide healthcare services for it. So as your organizations are looking at how to provide services, recognizing that you may have to establish a baseline and figuring out what that is for any one of you is something that, a discussion that you might want to have. So as we wrap up, some things we can do, as we talked all the way along the way, be self-aware. You can't control other people, your environments, can't control other environments, but it's important to be self-aware. Know where you stand on this, know where your organizations stand. Be aware of the language. Language, as we talked, is a big deal. The things that how you refer to individuals, the pronouns you use, the terms and terminology, they change, they morph, the letters add on, fall off. We're finding out more information, so be aware of the proper language to use. Keep an open mind and be respectful. Huge. We've talked about that all the way through to make sure that as you're talking about this, no one's expecting you to be the end-all, be-all, know-it-all, but be open-minded and be respectful. And if challenged, figure out, what direction to go in. Ask the hard questions. The best thing you can do is challenge yourself to ask the hard questions. When you don't know, ask the question. The worst thing that happens is that folks don't know, they don't ask, you never know. And the answer could be really easy, and the person right next to you, they have the answer. Challenge yourself to make mistakes. Mistakes are okay when you utilize the mistakes to build on and to become better. But if you don't try, you won't make mistakes. And so if you aren't making mistakes, it means you aren't trying. So try with the language and some of the other areas that we have. And then just keep the conversation going. We've shared some really good information and some experience here in the last couple hours. It's good to make sure that you keep the conversation going. I would ask that even in the room, if you would, if you are comfortable exchanging cards and dialoguing back and forth and sharing information, we're going to do that with you. It's a great way to make sure that you stay connected and that you're learning about what's happening in different environments, because the kids end up in different environments. They don't always stay over here and over there. But if you're in connection with someone else in another part of the state and the kid moves over there, the more you know, the more you can share with the kid, the more anxiety you'll be able to relieve. And so don't be afraid to just keep this conversation going, and make sure that your organizations, your homes, and your programs keep the conversation going. Don't ever let the conversation die, because there's so much out there, and as we talked today, there's so much information, there's so many needs and so many resources that if you don't keep the conversation going, then the only harm you're going to do is to your own program, and maybe whatever gains you've made, you might end up going backwards. So that's all I have for you folks today. I want to thank you for your time. Thanks for coming out, and thank you for sharing. Thank you for your transparency. Thank you for being vulnerable and answering the questions. And again, anytime that you need additional information or resources, please, please, please contact us at OYA. We're all available. We all have information, whether it's my office or whether it's Laura, who knows about the 729. You know, we all have a lot of information. We're a big organization. We're here for you, and we want to be that help. We really do. So thanks for coming out with us today.
Thank you, Brian.
All right.